When Ed hears this, he is satisfied his desire for an Apple computer has been understood. Edith's first interpretation of Ed's statement, exhibited in her follow-up question, did not satisfy him, but her second interpretation did. Both attempts on Edith's part were acts of interpretation, including the interpretation that appears to Ed to be the correct one. This is an important point for poststructuralists. Every encounter with an iteration requires an act of reading, of interpretation, even when we decide after the fact that the interpretation is appropriate. So although most conversations take place without any problem, that is, without one of the parties feeling he or she has been misunderstood, each iteration within the conversation is read in the broad sense and interpreted. For the most part, conversants don't notice this is happening because statements are not usually followed by objections, like Ed's snarky response, or by questions seeking clarification. Note, too, that although Ed was dissatisfied with Edith's original response to his request, there was no mistake on Edith's part. In the context suggested by this scenario, the word apple does inevitably refer either to the fruit or to the computer, and might have other reference as well. The iteration, then, was not taken amiss. We can only say that Ed felt that his intention was misunderstood. This is an important point of contention between the communication model and poststructuralism. An advocate of the communication model would insist that Edith's reading of the iteration was incorrect, whereas the poststructuralist would argue that that could only be true if there were no distinction between intention and iteration. So in the end, Ed was satisfied that he was understood. According to the communication model, the conversation ended as a successful communication because Ed's original intent was conveyed from his consciousness to hers. This model is predicated on the idea that the author's or speaker's intention is transmitted from consciousness to consciousness. Ed's intention in this model was initially hidden from Edith, but it was then successfully carried to her consciousness, where it was revealed. Before examining these premises, one could point out immediately that this model has already added unnecessary and unverifiable conjecture to the events we know took place. We do not know that the condition of Ed's intention had gone from a status of hidden to a status of revealed as the result of some unseen operation of transmission. It is true that something happened after Edith's first response. Something new entered the scene that apparently led to Ed's satisfaction, but it was not a revelation of intent. It was, rather, the arrival of two entirely new statements. One statement was Ed's, which provided more context to the conversation, and the other was Edith's. When a person makes a statement and somebody asks him, "What do you mean?" the only way that question is ever answered is with more text, that is, with a different iteration. The same is true of any iteration that can evoke the question, "What does that mean?" Let's say we have in front of us a speech from Hamlet. First, we read it. Then, just as we would with Ed's statement, "I'd like an apple," we can ask the question, "What does it mean?" even though the text is perfectly legible and we have no trouble discerning what it explicitly says. A literary text evokes this question more frequently than does everyday conversation, because we expect literature to have a significance that goes beyond its explicit statement. This expectation, however, does not mean that an iteration that we happen to call literary is of a fundamentally separate order from, say, a conversational iteration. Literary iterations seem to call more insistently for interpretation, largely because they tend to allow and evoke a greater multitude of contexts in which its terms can be read. As was the case with Edith and Ed, if one raises the question, "What does the text mean?" the only way that question can be answered is by offering a paraphrase or interpretation, which always takes the form of another text, a different iteration. Each reader's attempt at paraphrase or interpretation produces a further different iteration. Although advocates of the communication model sometimes suggest that an iteration and an intention could be identical in certain circumstances, the communication model itself clearly rejects this possibility. If the intention were ever identical to any iteration, That would mean the intention, obviously, is exactly that iteration, comprised of those specific words in that order in that language. The mere act of reading the statement would be the same as knowing the intention, since there would be nothing to that intention beyond those specific words. In that case, there could never be any question about a writer's conscious intention, and in fact, the very concept of intention would disappear in redundancy. So, the communication model is oriented by an intention that cannot itself be an iteration. To track the consequences of this further, it will be helpful to consider the fundamental unit of any writing system, the grapheme. The grapheme can be thought of simply as a mark. The only thing required to make a mark perceivable as such is the contrast it makes against a ground. Most writing systems require a further differential relationship, one that distinguishes one grapheme from another. The communication model suggests that the proper iteration will represent or express an intention. As the philosopher John Searle writes, to the extent that the author says what he means, the text is an expression of his intentions. The concept of expression is rooted in a metaphor of imprinting. In that relationship, the intention would be like a die or stamp, and the statement representing it will be the impression or expression left behind by the stamp. But in this conception, the intention would have to have the form of a specific iteration, a graphematic form which, as we've seen, the communication model prohibits. All such concepts of representation in relation to intention are troubled by this problem. An iteration cannot conform to an intention because intention can have no graphematic form. Even the concept of translation doesn't help, since it suggests an iteration that has been derived from another established iteration. There is no way to measure the adequacy of an iteration in relation to intention, because an intention has no objective features against which an iteration could be measured. If the intention itself is not an iteration, then no iteration can represent it as it is. So the communication model is troubling. It introduces metaphors of transmission that are not required to explain the interaction between Ed and Edith, where the participants utter a series of different context-refining statements until the parties feel, apparently, that no further context-refining remarks are required. Moreover, a communication model governed by intentionality faces further problems in what is called the teleology it necessarily incorporates. If an iteration is perpetually governed by an intention, that would mean the iteration has an intrinsic orientation, an orientation toward a goal or telos. But unless we are going to imagine that the orienting intention somehow accompanies the iteration on its transmission, directing the transmission in some ghostly way, we have to assume the iteration is in some way programmed by the intention with that orienting information. But this only leaves us back at the impossibility of an intention that informs an iteration without itself having any particular form. So what does this mean about the project of interpretation? Does it mean interpretation is an impossible or fruitless exercise? The short answer is no. A common complaint about the poststructuralist understanding of writing and speech is that, as it dethrones intention, it must necessarily conclude that all interpretations of a given text are equally appropriate or equally inappropriate. From this premise, some even go so far as to say that poststructuralism banishes the very idea of meaning or meaningfulness, and that it is a radical relativism that would leave us all floating in a hopeless void of uncertainty, chaos, misery, and madness. Fortunately or unfortunately, the reality is slightly less dramatic. Let's return to the scenario where a Shakespeare play has inspired a series of interpretations. Let's say the text in question is the famous speech in Hamlet that begins, "To be or not to be, that is the question." According to interpretation A, Hamlet is contemplating the ramifications of suicide. According to interpretation C, the speech is a meditation on the perils and rewards of chivalry,